It gives me great pleasure to also introduce at this time Dr. Krishna Prabha, the HOD of the Department of English PG, Kristu Jayanti College. My co-conveners, Professor Stephen and Professor Susan ma'am, who are also in the meeting. The MC for this session is me, Dr. Laila Thomas, and also a convener for this conference. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this great speaker today. I have heard his reputation from about how wonderfully he speaks. So all of us are in for a good treat right now. He is an essayist, critic, and translator. He is currently Professor and Head, Department of English, Punjabi University, Patiala. He is the author of In Disciplines, Notes on Politics, Education and Culture, Blood Flowers, Selected Poetry of Harbhajan Singh Hundal, Kavita Da Sama, The Time of Poetry, Maps of the Impossible, 6 Contemporary Hindi Poets, Readings and Translations in 2019, and Mauji Parinde, a translation of Rabindranath Tagore's Stray Birds into Punjabi. His forthcoming book is on Aristotle's Poetics, to be published this year by Coppercoin. He writes in English and Punjabi and translates between Punjabi and English and from Hindi to English. His work has appeared in Brevity, Film Philosophy, Tangentium, World Literature Today, The Book Review, Economic and Political Weekly, Mainstream, and The Wire. In addition to various reputed academic journals and newspapers, he has co-edited South Asian Ensemble, a Canadian-Indian quarterly of literature and the arts for 10 years, and teaches literary theory, modern European fiction, modern world poetry, and film studies. Sir, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And just wanted to inform, if sir is okay with this, there will be a brief question answer session at the end of this talk, sir.
Yeah, I would welcome it, yes.
Yes. Participants are welcome to type in their questions in the chat box and at the end of this session, I will read it out to sir. You can also raise your hand and the admin will enable you to ask your questions directly. So without further ado, can we start, sir?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being on board today and speaking to so many scholars, all brought together under your auspices. I'll be talking about the project of cultural studies in the Indian context, keeping in view the theme of the conference that you have decided upon. We'll begin with 2 questions of terminology, both suggested by the title of the conference, particularly through the words you are using like crossings and diffusion. Cultural studies, as I understand the discipline, is a transaction. Transaction in the sense of a carrying over and into from one side to the other. Now, interestingly, when we speak of transaction, usually the kind of imagination we have is of a horizontal transaction, not a vertical transaction. I mean, you cross the borders which are horizontally beside each other, but you do not step above or below a certain level. That is what I believe constrains the imagination of the scholars of cultural studies, particularly in the Indian context. Now, what I mean by this is there are, expanding upon this, you see, the idea of cultural studies, there are 2 terms in the Indian context we use frequently in religious discourse, popular religious discourse. One is Tirth, the place of pilgrimage, and the other is Avatar, incarnation, particularly the incarnation of the divine. Now, what is Tirth? Tirth is actually the place where you cross over into another realm. And in the context of the religious experience, that realm is a realm of transcendence. I am trying to think about cultural studies as an invitation to conduct a sort of pilgrimage from one realm of experience to another realm. And this is what I mean by the vertical crossing over. So it's not just crossing, it is crossing over. You carry yourself across into another world and you become someone else even as you retain what you were until now. So you become more than yourself and you give more than what you have taken to where you arrive. Now, this is a sort of ascent, right? So, pilgrimage to a tirth, a place of crossing over, is a sort of ascent. There is also then descent, which is indicated by the term avatar, divine incarnation, where God descends into the realm of the human and without in any way losing any part of Godhead. See, these are very strange points of meeting. These are very strange transfigurations, becomings other. Cultural studies is as an interdisciplinary activity a crossing over in the sense of a transcendence, whether into a higher realm or a realm reputed to be below the realm in which you normally operate. Now, when we look at the uh, question of boundaries, you see, boundaries exist because there are no clear boundaries. To go with Derrida, the very fact that we put borders and boundaries somewhere means that the distinctions are not actually clear or that they do not really exist. So it is upon us, the visitors, the pilgrims, the readers, the writers, the scholars of cultural studies, of literature, the human beings, whether we see Sima or Sandhi, whether we see the point of meeting as a point of separation or not. So, borders also indicate, when reversed, as the points of confluence. And this is where I think cultural studies really ideally should take root and flourish. And that is what, in the minds of the persons who introduced this field, I think dictated the project. I mean, this is how the project arguably originated and started to grow. Connecting, not separating. The second terminological issue I would wish to point to is the possibility of considering culture etymologically in relation to cultivation, being of the earth, growing, helping grow, letting sprout, and one day harvesting. So being connected to the earth, to the ground, to the root, to the mother and to be exposed to the love and fury of the elements. The word we usually have from some Indian languages, including, say, Sanskrit and Hindi, is Sanskriti for culture. Now, Sanskriti gives us a handle on the idea of sanskar. You see, in yoga and in Buddhism, especially in the Tantra traditions in both, you have this concept of Chitta Sanskar. It's a clarifying, it's an improvement, it's a strengthening of the consciousness. Culture is an activity in which we improve, strengthen, clarify what we have, what we make. In that sense, culture is work. It is work that we do on things, it is work that we do on language, it is work that we do on ourselves. Now, why this need to revisit the project of cultural studies in India? This is, you see, inspired by my experience on the ground. I have met quite a few young and not so young research scholars working in the domain of cultural studies. I have seen some dissertations of various levels in this field, and I can say that we probably badly need, a critical history of cultural studies in India. A critical history of cultural studies in India. Where cultural studies started, which direction or directions cultural studies has taken or have taken, and where we have arrived and where we are headed. We need to take account of all this and make ourselves accountable to the coming generations for the kind of work we have done or are doing or will in future do. Now, you can call it a sort of audit, but yes, critical intellectual audit of the work we do in the universities and colleges, in schools, is a necessity. Coming to the main argument that I would make, let me declare at the outset here that for me the touchstone of cultural studies remains that great essay of Raymond Williams, Culture is Ordinary. Why it remains the touchstone, you will see by the end of this lecture, because I'll talk about it at some length. There are two things actually that we have to consider. One is how cultural studies as a project was conceptualized, and the second is how in practice cultural studies have turned out. And what we do in the name of cultural studies in the departments of English or in the departments of various languages in this country, has it really fundamentally deviated from that point of origin, from that stated or unstated manifesto of cultural studies? Sometimes deviations and departures are needed and they are welcome, but sometimes deviations become perversions, distortions, escapes. evasions of the responsibility of the discipline to which we are committed, to the intellectual work to which we should be committed. Is that not the case? This is a question that I will implicitly be posing. Now, my hypothesis is that something has gone fundamentally wrong with the execution of the project of cultural studies in India. I don't mean that everything that has come out in the name of cultural studies is necessarily bad. I would rather say, and I'll state it very clearly towards the end of the lecture, that we can talk about good cultural studies and bad cultural studies. But my personal experience has been that most of the work that has been done and is being done in the name of cultural studies can only be called bad cultural studies. And what exactly has gone wrong? That is what I wish to dwell on. And the reason is young people, when they commit themselves to a long term project, like a doctorate in cultural studies, usually do not, and that is my experience. Yours might be different from mine. I would respect your opinion and your experience. A very large number of young people, because of obvious reasons, the principal reason being that we are young at that point, tend to believe that what is going on in research is what will continue to go on in the coming years also. I suppose when you commit yourself to a research project of this length, this scope, I mean the length and scope of a doctoral study, you are to talk about its viability and its density, its personal demand on you, and its promise. After all, you are giving some of the best years of your life to something. If it does not fundamentally enhance your personal, uh, I'll again use that term, personal density, a term I love and a term that I very recently discovered. If that personal density is not enhanced, I think the years are likely to be wasted. This term comes from this book. I'll show this book to you. I have read it very recently, and it's a 2020 book, Breaking Bread with the Dead. Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. Now, what has gone wrong with culture studies? As I see it, and as I said, it is based on a sort of ground report that I have personally gathered over the years. Culture studies have tended to deal with evanescent matters. Somebody writing a thesis on a TV serial which starts during the time the person is registering for PhD, plus some popular fiction work, genre fiction as we call it. Something that is mixing myth and crime, myth and science fiction. Now, we are too close to what is happening to be able to judge or guess how long will be the life of the thing we are studying, and whether by the time I complete my work, most people would even remember whether such a serial ever appeared on a certain TV channel or whether these books were even ever published. Because this is the age of, you see, very short attention spans, and bestsellers appear to be classics to those who have untrained readers' minds. But this is what is, first of all, I think, afflicts cultural studies, that it is wedded to evanescence largely. The second thing, and this is something you will agree, I believe, because I haven't seen people either disagreeing or sometimes readily agreeing, because this is something that brings us ourselves into the picture, and that is what we don't happily want to see. Most of the work done in the name of culture studies is poorly written. I mean, at the level of composition, it is extremely poor. It is as if you can get away with anything. You see, there are certain basic skills that you are supposed to possess. If you're going to get a PhD in English or in any language for that matter, the first thing is that you should command that language honorably and respectably. If you do not, there is no point beginning to write a thesis or even dreaming that you will write a thesis and you have written it, showing it to anybody. The third thing that afflicts culture studies, and you will see what are the reasons, I'll come to those reasons also, that I think produce this tendency to fall in love with evanescent subjects and to write poorly. The third is the tendency to shun complex objects of study. Culture studies does not mean, you see, that you should not be reading Tolstoy or Munshi Premchand or Shakespeare, or that you should not be studying great art, great architecture, considering some of the greatest music, the great classics. Nobody tells us to shun great complex texts of whatever kind. Serious cinema, for example. Majority of the research scholars pursuing culture studies will go for mass cinema, popular fiction. Why not serious literature, serious cinema, great music, great art? It's fine to study calendars. It is fine to study animation. Okay, but who stops you from studying great paintings as part of culture studies project? Now, this flirtation, and I'll use this word consciously, flirtation with mass culture and with popular culture, very strangely, in the name of rebellion against elitism, somehow also shuns folk culture, tribal culture. Very, very few culture studies projects deal with folk culture, with the languages of the people, with vernacular traditions. And this is actually a problem compounded in the departments of English. I mean, the departments of English somehow avoid taking on the study of, let's say, practices, cultural productions that are vernacular. Vernacular things are, you see, left to the departments teaching other languages. If we are actually crossing the borders, why can't we cross the borders of languages and of departments? Right? Then another problem with the research being conducted in culture studies is that the idea of work is not confronted in its seriousness. You see, after all, culture is work, civilization is work, reading is work, writing is work, thinking is work, and all this is hard work. There's a beautiful comparison Gabriel Garcia Marquez makes. He says, writing a novel is as difficult as making a table. See, he is reversing an academic comparison. An academic would prefer to say that writing is not like making a table. It is very difficult. Marquez rather says that writing a novel he personally finds is as difficult as making a table is for a carpenter. Because Marquez understands that writing a novel is also work, just as making a table for a carpenter is work. The writer is like a carpenter. Now, this attitude to labor, to work that transmutes any given thing into a work of art, that gives meaning and human worth to what you do, to a thing you find in nature. It's like, you see, from soil you make a bowl, from the sounds and the meanings you find, you make a literary work. The problem, unfortunately, is thin reading, habits of thin reading. It is easy to talk about text, but you forget that a text, even as a text, does not cease being a work, just as a work does not cease being a text. In a time when we challenge binaries, we unconsciously continue to subscribe to binaries. Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, is very much alive with the writer's voice and tone. Roland Barthes is not absent from that essay. The author of that essay is very much alive, and one of his later series of lectures talks about how he believes that the worthiest thing in a work of writing is how the writer makes himself or herself and enters the work of writing. It is the very opposite of what impression most people take from his essay and run away with it. The work of writing is primarily work, and the research scholars in culture studies need to pay attention to that aspect of writing as work. This will bring us also to the question of method, to which we shall return later. Now, what are the assumptions that guide this kind of misadventure? See, it's almost like a disaster, an accident that has happened. The project of culture studies has gone seriously wrong in many parts. The assumptions, and these are unacknowledged assumptions, that are responsible for this going wrong of the project of culture studies in India are such as the tendency to, as I said, shun classics, shun great literature, serious art. Somehow you will not find, and not find means actually not find, any projects of culture studies dealing with high art that we call high art. Why is it so? The assumption that high art is not radical enough, not socially relevant enough, is an unacknowledged assumption. Who can forget the painter Van Gogh's Potato Eaters? Is it not socially relevant? His last painting, as a sort of prophecy of his coming suicide, is it not socially relevant? Critics who have seen his paintings have found that the way he creates the boundaries of his objects in the paintings indicate his fear of a dissolving sense of self. On the opposite is Cézanne's tendency, his desire, even his aim to see where an object and its background actually meet each other and dissolve into each other. The very opposite. Cézanne seems to be entirely confident of himself and would rather encounter dissolution consciously. Van Gogh is scared of dissolution. Now, who stops us from revisiting great art as a work of cultural production? Is it not our own unacknowledged elitism? We think that if we treat popular fiction and mass fiction, etc., mass culture as the only fit object of study, we will be doing the really useful work. Whereas, whether it is Leonardo da Vinci or I mentioned Vincent van Gogh or anybody else, Cézanne had to wait for about 22 years before he could properly display his great paintings. But he did not compromise. Do you think it is easy work continuing to remain faithful to your dream? It is like, you see, a worker in a village making things of craft for years and years and years until somebody comes, sees his great work, and suddenly that person is there on the newspapers and on television channels. Most of the people are never there. They never get the recognition they deserve. Then, another affliction, and this is of course related, is presentism. Culture studies seems to be paralyzed by the present. As if the past does not exist, the future does not exist. And if there is any future, that future is only of science fiction. Why not the past of the 15th century, 14th century? Why not the history of languages and literatures, of cultural traditions? Why not? And this is this book, you see, The Age of Entanglement, the German-Indian intellectual engagements in the 19th and early 20th century. Then there is a book on the Roman India. India as it enters Roman imaginary through the Greeks and later through the Romans themselves. Why is this not a part of culture studies? Who is stopping it? Obviously, there are inhibitions. We think that the present is the only time, and this presentism is an ideology, and it is an ideology that suits a certain kind of world order in which memory is not prized, in which dreams are not prized, only fantasies are prized, and short memories are supposed to be sufficient. Then another assumption is that interdisciplinarity actually means indiscipline. Interdisciplinarity does not mean indiscipline, and it also does not mean disciplinary illiteracy. Now, I don't know how can I justify a study which requires training in sociology or anthropology. I am a person of literature. I can have an amateur's view of certain things which somebody who is into a certain discipline would better understand. But the problem that has appeared everywhere with culture studies is that the departments of English have stopped engaging seriously with great literature, with serious criticism, and they are like foraying into areas of psychology, history, anthropology, sociology without getting adequate training and familiarity with the tools of those disciplines. Is this a good situation? I guess you know what kind of situation this is. Then, if culture studies is really a radical, revolutionary interruption of the tired, old, fatigued ways of talking about literature, writing about literature, understanding literature, then why is it that culture studies failed to produce a radical methodology? Why is it that the dissertations get written the way they were written in pre-cultural studies days? Why can't you create a dissertation in the form of a movie, in the form of a documentary, in the form of a photo album, or a mixture of various genres? Why not? The problem, as I see it, is a fundamental problem, and that problem was best articulated by Theodore Adorno. The unresolved antagonisms of reality appear as immanent problems of form, he said. He said this in aesthetic theory, I believe. Yeah, it is aesthetic theory. Maybe I am wrong, but I can check and revert to you later in case you want, otherwise, you can find it out. See, Adorno was making the point that if we believe that we have resolved a contradiction at the level of content, or if we have brought about a radical shift in content, but the form remains unchanged, unchallenged, something is wrong. That is, the change is not really radical. Cultural studies, as we witness these happening in this country, is a clear proof of the failure of radicalization of the disciplines or interdisciplinarity in this domain. The form remains the old form, and the content apparently has changed. Then, another thing that stops culture studies from realizing the promise it had when it got launched. The scholar in culture studies has a tendency to attempt what can be done, not what should be done. You can write something on matchboxes. You can write something on calendars of the last, say, 20 years. You can write something on the changing models of cars. But if you are looking for some kind of profundity of observation, that will only come if you are also into a serious engagement with the arts as arts, with art as art, with science as science. That is, without the ability to read photography as art, a photograph as a work of art, you are unable to comment on it meaningfully. Anybody can write anything on anything as long as they just want to write something. But should it be written? Is it worth the years you spend doing it? That is what we have to ask ourselves. Then, the pursuit of art demands scholarship of patience and long, hard years of labor. Culture studies somehow, as I have seen this field unfolding, has not indicated any patient dedication to the object of study. Very, very few examples, very, very few would be available if you go around trying to find it. You will even see that some of the greatest minds among the young and not so young and the old have actually not been able to realize their potential and promise because they succumbed to the seductions of culture studies as a discipline that seemed to be very revolutionary but actually turned out to be deceptively radical and revolutionary. Well, there is no experiment at the level of method, that is creative critical mixture. You have seen this happening in the case of French feminist writers and theorists. Like Hélène Cixous, you can describe neither as creative nor as critical, but she is both and she transcends the categories. So, scholarly creative, academic creative, creative critical, these confluences of methods that culture studies should have ideally helped blossom has not happened. Okay? And the failure of experimentation at the level of form, which would be, as I said, the ultimate test of culture studies doing anything really groundbreaking, that failure is indicated in the failure of genre bending. Culture studies has not been able to do any genre bending as far as it is based in the academy, in the university. And that is why I would say that real cultural studies are not happening in the universities. They are happening elsewhere. Uh, Look at this. This is a book, Figuring by Maria Popova. Maria Popova, Figuring. This is an example of culture studies. Biography, art, imagination, sciences, history, intersecting, interwoven, and yielding insights you would never find in single disciplines. You have this also, and this is, of course, comes from a university, Harvard. She's a Harvard professor, Marjorie Garber. Many of you would be familiar with her work, Shakespeare and Modern Culture. This is the kind of work that is produced when you engage with classics and with current culture together. Or you have this Khuri Gata's The Last Days of Mandelstam. She's a poet, writes a prose poem which is history, criticism, social criticism, political analysis, biography, all together in about 100 pages. Something that you cannot do if you follow one of the genres or one of the domains only. So this is the kind of genre bending I'm talking about when I say what kind of genre should cultural studies express itself in. Okay, you have Anne Carson's work, She too deals with classics as well as with contemporary manifestations of culture. You have Han Kang's The White Book. You have Teju Kole's Blind Spot, photography and prose. You have a great work, not much talked about in India, Vanessa Luiselli's Tell Me How It Ends. It's a set of narratives of her experiences of talking to little kids, crossing over from Mexico into America, what happens to them, and how their parents live or die, and where they go or how they vanish. It is literature, as history, as politics, as political manifesto. Can the academy accommodate to this kind of courage, this audacity of methodology? If it cannot, culture studies is a dead field of study. All right, we'll now come to, and I'm coming towards the end, why Raymond Williams's essay, as I said, is a touchstone for me. I have frequently heard that he says culture is ordinary. Yes, he says culture is ordinary because that is the title of the book, of the essay. There is this book of Francis Fukuyama also, right? The End of History and The Last Man. Fukuyama said that people had been carried away by the title of his book, and that too the first half of the title, and they had entirely misread the argument of his work. He never said that history has come to an end in this sense. The same has happened, I believe, to this essay of Raymond Williams. He doesn't say all culture is ordinary or culture is only ordinary. He talks about two things. Culture is ordinary, he says, yes, it is a way of life, a whole way of life. And then he says it's also the arts and learning. Who deleted the second part of his definition? Nobody. And yet we have become blind to the second half. He talks about learning as ordinary in his family. He rejects the intellectual's tea shop as well as the drinking hole of the hippie, of the hipsters. Okay? He talks about the individual's obligation to deal with common meanings of society and of amending those meanings. He sees that the contribution of culture is ultimately an individual contribution. A writer's job, he says, is to do with individual meanings and with the making of those meanings common. He insists on fine language. His essay is polemical, personal. It's like a memoir. It is empirical, it is historical, it is scholarly, it is essayistic, and it is elegant and lucid and precise. How much of culture studies follows this model? Another model we can follow would be Walter Benjamin's Arcades project or his great essay, A Brief History of Photography. But these are the things we do not like to do because these are difficult things. So I would say, if only we go back to the masters, the founders of culture studies, and see how they wrote, what they really said instead of falling for opinions, we will at least retain a bit of the serious scholarship that we are supposed to have. And that is the only guarantee that our work will have some worth in the present and in the future. Right? It is not that surfaces are always superficial. Think of Baudelaire and Balzac. The surface can be deeper than depth, but it depends on how long we are going to be attentive to the surface. If our opinions override the demands of the surface to be attended to, the work will be thin, insignificant, and will not be either culture or study. Right? Thank you very much. I have exceeded the time by, I think, 4 minutes. I apologize. Thank you so much.
So we are still speechless listening